Hello, everyone. So I wanted to do the same sort of thing I did last time with chapter one of the Ignorant Schoolmaster and help you to delve a little more deeply into this second chapter. And I hope the book is really starting to open up for you. I think this second chapter and the next chapter after this are some of the best. It's really, really exciting stuff, no matter how you fall down on what Rancière is saying. So we can open up here, I think, with this mantra that he'll repeat several times throughout the book. I guess derived from Jacques II, this way, the universal way of learning. So he'll say this over and over again. This is how people actually learn. You talk about what you see, or you have something there, and you say, "Tell me what you see there." It could be a drawing, a painting, whatever it is, and then you get the student to talk about what they see. If they give you a very superficial answer, it's a drawing. Well, then maybe the next day you come back again, show it to them again, and say, can you tell me again what you see here? And you're trying to get them to really take a good hard look at it. Then after that, you talk about, well, tell me what you think about this. And then finally, what do you make of this? So he'll refine this periodically throughout the book, but that's really the gist of it. And you can think about how this basically what I want you to be thinking about is how this differs from other teaching methods. Maybe some teachers might start off with what the student should make of this, and then tell the student what they should think about it, and then maybe even go so far as to tell the student what they should see there, what's actually there. So that'd be the opposite form of this, what he would call the explicator's method, right? Another important thing to think about here is this focus on materiality. It's always something that you can see, something you can touch, hold. That's going to be important throughout this book. Okay, so here we have the first principle of universal teaching. One must learn something and then relate everything else to it. So I think for Rancière or Jacques II, this something else is some kind of language, right? Everything is a language. Carpentry is a language. Anatomy is a language, right? Then you have the real, something like French, Spanish, Latin, whatever it is. You have to learn that language before you can really say that you've learned something, right? And I think this is true for anything. Think about rhetoric, for example. Can you really learn rhetoric without learning all the terminology that goes with it and being able to relate those terms to other things? So I'm kind of curious what you think of his definition of a classic here, because I think this is kind of enlightening. And he'll talk more about this in the third chapter when he gets into masterpieces and all this. But he says a classic is a book in which a language presents the essential of its forms and its powers. So I thought this was really an interesting definition, because you remember from the first chapter, he said, he gave him that book, Telemark, but then later he said it could have been any book. Because really what's important is that you're able to recognize the human intelligence at work in the book, and also to see that you could do that as well, that you have access to that intelligence. So then he goes a little bit more into why he doesn't like explications. He says, any man who is taught is only half a man. And if you think about his mantra again, I think that should start to be a little clearer to you what he means by this. Right? If you're taught something, quote unquote, then you didn't learn it on your own, and you're almost, did you really learn anything through that, technique? He says, he goes a little further here. He says, the genius of the explicators. So what these explicators have really done for themselves is set up the strongest possible chains of stultification. And part of the way that's done is not just by making the child feel like he or she is inferior in intellect, but also as the child progresses through the ranks, the grades, he or she becomes conscious of their own superiority, right? So in a way, getting a college degree, getting a master's degree or a PhD might actually be stultifying if by getting that degree you become convinced that you have a superior mind to someone else. That's what Rancière is really battling against throughout this whole book, is this idea that anybody can be superior or anybody can be inferior to anyone else in terms of intelligence. Now, that's not to say they don't know more about something, He'll get into this, especially in chapter 3, because just because you have the capacity doesn't mean you have exerted your will to the degree of someone else. So let's not get that confused. He also talks about, and again, this is kind of coming back to this focus on the materiality of things. What he seems to me wants to get away from is, I guess, sort of more metaphysical ideas, or needing, I guess, some sort of an inspiration. That's sort of a model. But he really thinks that when these two minds come together, these two equal intelligences come together to try to understand each other, they need to have something there. He talks about that being the book. I think about a text. You could imagine a seminar class, say a literature class, and you've got students there and you're trying to discuss a poem, let's say. What is the poem? Tell me what you see in this poem. What do you make of it, etc. And you always can tell the students that haven't actually read the poem, or they haven't actually read the reading, right? Because what they're saying can't in any way be verified in the text. So you've probably done this, or had it done to you, maybe. Or the professor might say, well, show me that in the text, right? Let's take a look at the text. Show me, where the author says that. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at here. But even more than that, look at the form of that sign, of what he calls the adventures of each sentence, the lesson of these volumes. Later on, he'll talk more about how the poet has a vision or some thoughts they're trying to express. They have to express this in the form of a language, which they, depending on how much willpower or much energy they put into it, how much time, etc., is going to be evocative or not, right? But the reader of the poem also has to do the work of retranslating that, sort of taking that language, translating it back into their own sensations. So it's always kind of a two-way journey here. He talks at one point about parabolas. We're all sort of circling the truth, right? And we can't just transmit that truth perfectly. There's always a kind of a process that goes along in the middle, and that's really where the realm of the intelligence is all about. Okay, then we get to attention. This is going to be an important thing for Rancière, because this is kind of what the role of the teacher is, right? The ignorant schoolmaster. Maybe you don't know anything about the subject matter you're trying to teach, but you can tell if the students are actually applying themselves or not, right? Are the students paying attention? Are they really trying to make an effort to learn the material, or are they not? It's kind of the E for effort model, right? So he says, attention is the act that makes an intelligence proceed under the absolute constraint of a will. He calls that attention. And he says this over and over again, right? What you think is the difference in intelligence, intellectual capacity, what you're really seeing there are differences in the energy exerted by the will towards our intelligence. You're using your will to control this intelligence and not the other way around. So wondering what you thought about that point. Okay, so I'll notice some of the nuggets and responses. And by the way, though, those have been wonderful, amazing. I'm really enjoying the discussions this book is generating. I hope we can keep up that momentum, as we're discussing these texts and really trying to see and what you think about them and all. So a lot of people were kind of bothered by this idea where it seems to kind of bash the Socratic method. And I've thought a lot about this, and he does elaborate on this in later chapters, but he says at one point the Socratic method is the perfected form of stultification. So that really kind of, I think, upset some people in the class, because they thought of it was the opposite, right? The Socratic method was a way to get away from, I guess, what you call maybe directives in education, that sort of thing. But you kind of want to have a little bit of a finer understanding about how he's thinking about Socrates, or how he's seeing Socrates in these various dialogues. Just the problems, I think, right off the bat with this, the Meno. Basically, the point of that dialogue is Socrates is saying, look, we don't learn things, we just remember things, right? At one point before we were born, we knew everything, we had access to the truth. Once we were put into this imperfect world, we've forgotten everything, and basically the truth is kind of innate. We just have to find a way to get to it again. And the way he demonstrates this to his, I forget who the interlocutor is here, but this sort of master of slaves, or this guy that has a bunch of slaves, not unusual. Ancient Greece was a slave society, right? So he says, bring me one of your slave boys here, and I'll guide him. I'll ask him all these questions, and then I'll show you that he actually has this innate understanding or innate knowledge of some geometry. And sure enough, he asks the boy some questions, has him draw some things and answer some questions, and he proves at the end, and well, look, all along this slave boy understood this or knew about these geometry proofs, right? The problem is with this Rancière, beyond the obvious problem, there's a slave and a master, right? That Rancière would, he's all about equality, so there's a big problem there. But also this idea that, without Socrates there to ask these questions, the slave boy would have never been able to come up with these proofs on his own, right? He had to have Socrates. And, the way this is laid out, everybody's kind of looking up to Socrates. Socrates is asking these questions. He's kind of in the position of authority over the student. It's not the slave coming up with these questions himself and so on and so forth. So it's a very sort of, Socrates is like, here, let me take my hand and I'll guide you to the truth. And by the way, at the end of this, you should have really a lot of respect for me because I was the one able to do this. You couldn't have done this on your own. So if you can sort of see the Socratic method in that way, you might sort of see why Rancière is kind of has a problem with it, right? So the demonstration of his knowledge, slave's knowledge, is just a demonstration of his powerlessness. So he couldn't have come up with this on his own, had to have Socrates there. Socrates interrogates a slave who was destined to remain one. So that's a very haunting thought as well. You could argue, though, as many people have, the Platonic dialogues are meant to be a model. You're supposed to be asking, reading these dialogues and then asking yourself these kinds of questions. But again, I think that the problem is if you hold up Plato, Socrates, or anybody else as this authority that you should just follow, then you're stultifying yourself, right? You shouldn't have to follow anyone. You have your own path that you should be following instead of the path laid out by anybody. So why is it Jacques method the blind leading the blind? And this is a key point here. So the ignorant schoolmaster, I think I used the example last time. Let's just say I know very little about anatomy. Right? Never taken an anatomy course, but if I want to teach a course in anatomy, I could still do that according to Rancière or Jacques and be quite good at it as long as I obeyed thought about some principles, right? So one, I'm not going to be verifying what the student has found. I don't know enough about anatomy to know that, right? I don't know if the student in my class has actually learned anatomy or not. What I can verify, though, is that the student has searched. So we can tell, was the student put a lot of energy into the course? Did the student ask a lot of questions, really look at that anatomy textbook? Is the student able to talk about it in some detail? Can I verify that? And I think we all know we can tell that, right? Again, if you assign a reading in class, you can tell which students have done the reading because they'll be talking about it in a very different way than the student who has not read it and is just trying to BS his or her way through the discussion, right? Class issues. So he comes back to this a few times in this chapter and come back again later. But there's a lot of, I think Rancière is very concerned about the class issues we talked about last time with those May 1968 protests and so on. So there's kind of a problem with stultification that goes beyond just classroom. I think extends into society, to a nation or even to the world, right? A lot of this inequality is so entrenched. And he points out the same nature that opens up a career in science to all minds wants a social order where the classes are separated and where individuals conform to the social state that is their destiny. And so I was thinking about the Occupy Wall Street movement. We saw a lot of the same kind of questioning, right? Look, I've gained all this critical knowledge, this critical thinking skills, but now I'm expected just to be the working at Starbucks or McDonald's. There seems to be a lot of elitism, not just maybe it begins in the educational system, but then it carries over. Uh, and it talks about the double stultification of the kid who, at school they're taught the only way you can learn is with a teacher. And then at home they're kind of taught, well, this is our lot in life to continue in this vocation, whatever that might be. This is kind of not our place to be up there with that 1%, if you will. So you can end up in a double stultification out of education and then carrying over into I think what he calls sort of a home education of morality. So here's another one, this idea of intellectual snobbery that'll come. I don't know, he never uses that term as far as I can remember anyway. But I was thinking about it. If you believe there's a big distinction between manual labor and the knowledge that accumulates around, say, a trade, a vocation, if you think there's a big difference between that kind of intelligence and what happens at the academy, what Jacques Atteux or Rancière calls the clouds of rhetoric, that can also lead to stultification. I was thinking about this in terms of art, sort of with a capital A, something you might learn about in college, versus arts and crafts. You might go to one of these arts and crafts shows, and there's sort of a tendency for snobs, I guess, people that feel really superior, to think, this isn't art. This is just sort of common people making things. There's no real art to this. And, I despise that attitude just in general. And I think Rancière would be on the same wavelength with me on this. So just look, there's no difference in intelligence between the people making these quilts and the people painting these, frescoes or whatever. It's just a question of understanding and speaking a language. Again, we come back to this idea of the quilter is speaking a language, right? It's a different language than the painter painting the fresco. But it's always a question of, do I understand what they're saying, or what do I understand the language they're trying to communicate with me? And everything is in everything. So that same intelligence that is at work trying to communicate to me through the language of quilting, let's say, is the same intelligence at work in the painter of the fresco trying to communicate to me through that medium. Okay, then he comes back to Plato again, and this idea of writing versus speaking. And for Rancière, he says the book is the equality of intelligence. And I'll save some of this for the next chapter because it goes into more detail here from the part of the Phaedrus that he's referencing or alluding to here. But if you've read the Phaedrus, which I hope you have, Plato talks there about, or Socrates, the dialogue has a part where the subject come up of basically what's better or what's closer to the truth, writing versus speaking. And Plato has a lot of problems with writing, prefers speaking for various reasons. But Rancière wants to flip that around. And again, we'll come back to that again next time. And then finally we get to this, I think it might have, this is the last slide here. So I thought I would bring it back to this idea of a seminar class, because you have sort of the lecture model of education, right? And a lot of people have problems with this idea of the know-it-all expert, sage on the stage model of a professor up there at a lectern, lecturing to hundreds of students. A lot of people don't like that setup for many, I think, very compelling reasons, right? But you could say, well, how about a seminar class instead, where people are gathered around a circle and they're sort of having this conversation. So I think for Rancière, that would be getting closer to a good model. But there's still some problems even with a seminar student, right? And he talks about this to learn, to improve. If you want to learn if you want to learn this language of quilting, let's say, or the fresco art, whatever, composition, you have to overcome the pride that disguises itself as humility, as an excuse for one's incapacity to speak in front of others. That is, one's refusal to submit oneself to their judgment. So I really thought about this long and hard, because I don't know about you, but as a student in these seminar classes, and I had many, I the professors would usually say something like, look, Matt, I could tell you're a smart guy because, I've read the essays that you've handed in to me. Well, why don't you ever speak up in class? And I would always say, well, I'm kind of shy, basically. But the more I think about it, the more I think that Ranciere's correct here, or Jacques too. It was kind of a pride in me that I didn't want to say something and somebody else critique me, in that sort of scenario, right? When really that would have been a far better way for me to learn. I just kept putting my ideas out there, trying to express my ideas. Maybe other people don't agree with me or might have disagreed with me, but that's really the only way we can learn, right? We have to overcome that reticence. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. I'll be back to talk about chapter 3 soon. I hope you're enjoying the class as well, and please let me know all your thoughts on this. Let me know what you're seeing in these passages or what you're not seeing, and maybe I can help you as an ignorant professor, I suppose. But anyway, I'll see you next time.